In the beginning, he breathes life into us, and we make our arrival on the earth.
You can hear the birds sing.
On the 20th of July, 1933, a son was born to a young couple, Josiah IRUKWU Ogbonnaya and his wife, Sophine Nneke IRUKWU Ni Ekechukwu of Okoko Item. The family was from Indiawele, Amabuku, Amokwe Item in Bende local government in Abia State, southeastern Nigeria. They named him Joseph Jomike Ogbonnaya. He was the first of 10 children. Members of the extended family were influential in the Methodist Church, which embraced his parents. He was christened at the Methodist Church in Item. A major influence on Ogbonaya's life was his unconventional paternal grandmother, Nennem, a feisty woman who instilled some of the values that he held throughout his life. It was to her that Ogbonaya's father turned with his concerns that his first son, who was growing up in northern Nigeria, could not speak their language. In typical fashion, she guaranteed that a stint with her in the village would result in his fluency in not just Igbo, but the more complex Item dialect. Ogbonnaya found himself without warning transported to Item, to Nennem's domain, where he remained for several months. In that time, she refused to speak to the young boy in any language but Igbo. He recalled this experience as one of the harshest of his young life. But at the end, he was returned to his family, speaking both Igbo and the Item dialect fluently. Throughout his life, he remained grateful for this skill and the myriad ways in which Nennem impacted him as he strived to emulate her unwavering loyalty to her family.
Ogbonaya's father, Papa, was an astute businessman who traded in textiles and palm produce. The economic depression of the 1930s adversely affected the palm produce trade and consequently his business enterprises. He was, however, able to pivot and adopted a recovery strategy which involved relocating his family to Zonkwa in Kaduna State and diversifying into the haulage business. Ogbonnaya was about 5 years old when the rapidly expanding family settled in northern Nigeria. There he imbibed the northern culture completely, spoke the language fluently, and was given the nickname Danladi Zonkwa. His brother, Sunday Sochi Ogan, who was a year younger, was called Yusuf Zonkwa. This foundation formed the basis for the rich relationships and strong bond he had with people of northern extraction. Some of these close-knit friendships, spanning several decades, were with Alhaji Mohammed Koguna of Koguna Babura Insurance Brokers, Alhaji Mohammed Hassan, who was chairman when Ogbonnaya was managing director of Nigeria Reinsurance Corporation, Alhaji Aliko Mohammed, and Lieutenant General Theophilus Yakubu Danjuma. While Zonkwa was productive economically, a major drawback was the absence of a school in the area at the time. His father would never compromise on education, and so together with his brother Sochi, he was sent to the Holy Trinity School in Kafanchan, Kaduna State, under the care of an uncle who, whilst not a biological family member, was the only Item man in Kafanchan. Ogbonnaya and his brother Sochi were not immune to some youthful mischief. One day, they decided they had had enough of school and hatched a plan to run away and make their way back to Zonkwa 9 miles away. They set out, 2 little boys aged 6 and 5 years, and began walking along the railway tracks. Their fear that they might encounter Quora, hyena, along the way was swallowed up by their misery, and so they continued undeterred. Not long after, they were picked up by railway workers inspecting the tracks. Both boys were excited to be travelling in the railway carriage. They let them off at Zonkwa. Flushed with the success of their escape, Ogbonnaya and Sochi made their way to the family compound, but their excitement was short-lived. Papa was not amused in the slightest. He made his displeasure known in the way that the typical Nigerian patriarch expresses displeasure. They were given a good hiding, lectured on the benefits of a sound education, and returned unceremoniously to Kafanchan. Ogbonaya's parents moved to Jos in a continuing search for a better life, and both Sochi and Ogbonnaya were transferred to St. Paul's School in the city. Located in Plateau State, in north-central Nigeria, Jos was one of the nation's most cosmopolitan cities, a melting pot of tribes, religions, and races drawn there by various factors, including its temperate climate and business opportunities. The Igbos, an entrepreneurial people, had settled in droves in Jos and established various trades and businesses. After a couple of years, and without warning, Ogbonnaya was uprooted yet again. It happened by way of a family meeting between his father and paternal uncle, during which it was agreed that at 10 years old, he was old enough to be primed to take on his responsibilities as the first son of a burgeoning family. The belief of his people was that first sons were instrumental in determining the future of younger siblings. Perhaps in unconscious rebellion against this responsibility, many first sons were known to have mischievous streaks, and Ogbonnaya was certainly in that category. Both his father and uncle felt that a swift uncoupling from his mother's influence and maternal coddling was necessary. Papa's older brother, Jacob Nkrumah, aka De Jacob, was the head of the Methodist Middle School in Otukpo, Benue State, located in Nigeria's Middle Belt region. It was to him that the next phase of his educational development was entrusted. De Jacob was a sterner version of Papa, a no-nonsense disciplinarian with a reputation for straightening out rascally youth. Several young boys lived with him and his family, and like a human production line, he had been charged with ensuring that they received a good education and emerged persons of good character. And so, Ogbonnaya and Sochi joined his flock. De Jacob had a meeting of minds with Papa on the value of a good education, and he would settle for nothing less than first place at the end of each school term. Interestingly, Ogbonnaya had a classmate whose uncle had a similar disposition, also insisting that his ward achieve the top position in the class. Both boys quickly realized the inevitability, and that at the end of each term, one of them would surely be acquainted with their uncle's stick. The realization created a bond that lasted well into adulthood. Over time, Ogbonnaya became something of an all-purpose clerk to De Jacob and found himself working in proximity with his supervisor, Reverend Stanley Walter Smith, a distinguished Englishman who worked for the Methodist Missionary Society as an educational missionary between 1937 and 1952. The society had its headquarters in Ovim and Umuahia, in present-day Abia State. This period opened a new world to him, impressing upon him the idea that education and knowledge are continuous, and one is never too old to gain both. It showed him the futility of life without a commitment to God and one's fellow beings. He came to believe that a successful future was within his reach, although the way forward was unclear. He eventually set his heart on a career in law, believing that this was the best way to affect society. Ogbonnaya worked and studied in Aba for a time, securing pre-university entry requirements through the University of London General Certificate of Education and boosting his college fund. He was part of a group of academically driven young men who wanted more out of life. They were focused on individual plans to proceed overseas to acquire further education in their chosen professions. They were to go abroad in search of the Golden Fleece. As the young Ogbonnaya prepared for his departure overseas, little did he know that in a few years, in 1962, he would emerge as the first lawyer from Item when he was called to the English bar and enrolled as a solicitor and advocate of the Supreme Court of Nigeria. For now, he carried with him the hopes and expectations of his family, friends, and community in Aba. The collective joy was expressed at send-off parties held in his honor when he was told never to forget his culture or roots, and encouraged by smiling strangers to behave well and indeed return with the Golden Fleece. A noisy group of well-wishers accompanied him to Port Harcourt Airport, where he boarded a propeller aircraft operated by the West African Airways Corporation. His well-wishers included his mother and her church friends, who were prone to burst into song at the slightest provocation. They duly sang, crooning lustily as if on cue. Each of the 20 passengers on the aircraft appeared to have an identical send-off entourage. It was a picture of pleasant chaos. They waved non-stop until the crowd was out of sight, and then Ogbonnaya settled back in his seat, focusing on what lay ahead. 1 hour later, they touched down at Ikeja Airport in Lagos, where they were greeted by another welcoming party, which included his cousin, IRUKWU, a customs officer, and a small contingent of Item people resident and working in Lagos. Ogbonaya's first major assignment on this adventure of life was the successful completion of a week-long preparatory course organized by the British Council, which included sections on how to be a good student, solving accommodation problems, and relating to landladies. At the end of the week, he boarded merchant vessel Oriole for the 13-day journey from Apapa Wharf in Lagos to Liverpool Harbour in England. When the ship docked, he and fellow student emigres were met by representatives of the British Council who put them on a train to London. In London, they were welcomed by yet another group of British Council representatives and Ogbonaya's cousin Agu, who was working on his PhD at Guy's Hospital, London. He was taken to his accommodation, the British Council student hostel based at No. 1 Hands Crescent in Knightsbridge. The hostel accommodated about 300 students aged between 25 and 35 years, drawn from about 30 Commonwealth countries in Africa, Asia, the West Indies, and the host country, the United Kingdom, studying at various universities and other educational institutions in the London area. Ogbonnaya made several friends from across the world during his years at Hands Crescent, most of whom subsequently returned to their respective home countries to diverse roles in nation building and human development. Beginning his legal journey, he enrolled at Holborn College, London, and subsequently at Lincoln's Inn, one of the 4 Inns of Court in London to which barristers of England and Wales belong. His choice of Lincoln's Inn was guided by his friend, late Justice Ademola Candido Johnson, who advised it had one of the best law libraries in the United Kingdom. He also enrolled at the Council of Legal Education in Stone Buildings, Lincoln's Inn, and became actively involved in student union affairs. In his second year, he was elected secretary of the Students' Union and later the first African president in almost 200 years. As he approached the end of his legal studies, he developed an interest in insurance and enrolled at the Chartered Institute of Insurance. He attributed the kindling of his interest once again to the invisible hand that guided him through life. As he learned more, he concluded that insurance awareness was one of the best ways of improving the well-being of any nation. He realized that insurance was neither properly projected nor understood in Nigeria and in Africa, and began the process of obtaining the necessary qualifications. For the rest of his time in the United Kingdom, he studied insurance alongside legal studies and finally received his qualifications in 1964 after returning to Nigeria. As it turned out, insurance became an intrinsic part of his life, and he became the first insurance lawyer in Africa. His call to the bar in 1962 symbolized the attainment of the expectations of his people, and so he returned to Nigeria, settling in Lagos, which was then Nigeria's political and commercial capital. Several friends and colleagues who came from all parts of the country were based in Lagos, which was the ideal place for young professionals of their generation who were trained abroad to live and work. He was focused on playing a key role in transforming the landscape so that Nigeria and Africa would become major players in the world of insurance. He decided to start his career in the private sector with one of the leading British insurance companies operating in the country, the West African Provincial Insurance Company. They shared his corporate philosophy and aspirations and would give him the freedom to practice his 2 professions of law and insurance. Shortly after his return, he attended a reception to welcome him home, hosted by his uncle, Professor Kesandu Okoronkwo Ogan, chief gynecologist at the Island Maternity Hospital in Lagos, and his wife at their Ikoyi residence. His uncle introduced him to a young lady, Eno Maria Etuk, an up-and-coming broadcast executive at the state-owned broadcasting organization, Radio Nigeria. She was the second daughter of Mrs. Grace Etuk and her husband, Chief Samson Udo Etuk. Instantly, his interest was piqued. He knew the Etuk family from Etinan in Akwa Ibom State through his long-standing friendship with their first son, Dr. Ebong Etuk. He had subsequently met his mother, Mrs. Grace Etuk, and his other siblings, brother Eko, and three sisters, Sisiba, Elizabeth, and Regina. Mrs. Etuk, Gomi as she was fondly called, managed the government catering guest houses in eastern Nigeria, where Ogbonnaya stayed as he traveled across the country for work. Impressed as he was by her grace, dignity, and kind disposition, she was his picture of the perfect mother-in-law. He purposed long before he met Eno that he would marry one of her daughters. They had a lot to talk about that first meeting, and 1 year later, in 1963, they got married. The young couple settled in Lagos into the life of young professionals with an active social life and exciting jobs. They soon welcomed their first son, Agu, in 1964 and their second child, Ikechi, the following year. Things changed in 1966. The January coup and the counter-coup of July had created previously unknown ethnic and tribal tensions in the nation. While he was abroad attending a course, the situation in Lagos became volatile, with many Igbo families fearing for their safety. His uncle, Professor Okoronkwo Kesandu Ogan, to whom he had entrusted the care of his young family, gathered up both his own and Ogbonaya's family and took them to Enugu. His niece, Ama Ogan, who was then 8 years old, gave an account of that trip home in a tribute to her Auntie Eno after her passing in 2009.
Auntie Eno packed the children into the car and drove all the way in a convoy that included 3 families. I remember looking back many times during that long journey, and she was always there, hands on the steering, focused. I had never seen a woman drive that kind of distance, did not in fact know that one could. There were comments and questions of the typical kind at petrol stations where we stopped to refuel, but she behaved as if she heard nothing. I got a feeling that others were waiting for her to capitulate and ask for help, but she saw no need to, or decided she was not going to give anyone that satisfaction. It was her burden. She was up to it.
On his return to Nigeria, Ogbonnaya stayed in Lagos until May of the following year, when it became clear that it was increasingly unsafe to remain. He left Lagos and his longtime friend, Dr. Eugene Mbojikwe. After a harrowing 2-week journey, he was reunited with Eno and the 2 boys. In the days following his relocation, he began working at the Enugu branch office of West Africa African Provincial Insurance Company, and as time went on, he became coordinator of the branch offices in Aba, Port Harcourt, and Onitsha. Life was relatively peaceful. Eno continued working for Radio Nigeria until the war broke out. It was in the early days of the war that the young couple welcomed their 3rd child, Chizo. The young family fled when Enugu was invaded, moving to Port Harcourt, Umuahia, Aba, and Olu, never staying in one location for long periods but moving on as each place became unsafe. Concerned for the children, they decided to send them to their paternal grandparents in their ancestral village. Item was relatively safe as it was too far from the war front and so did not suffer air raids. Ogbonnaya would make the weekly visits from Umuahia to Item to see them, cutting through the forests on his motorbike or in his Volkswagen Beetle to avoid army roadblocks. One day, he learned through the local grapevine that forces were on their way to Item. Knowing that his parents and the rest of the community would flee to their plantations deep in the forest and concerned that the children could not survive life in those circumstances, he set out to get them. When he left Item, his group consisted of his 3 children, 2 nannies, and 4 other children whose parents had begged him to take to safety. The small Volkswagen Beetle, crammed with 10 occupants, weaved its way through the bushes, driving deep into the forests whenever shooting broke out in the distance. The war finally ended in January 1970, after 30 months of destruction, chaos and death. Ogbonnaya returned to Lagos with his family, receiving, as was the case for every adult returnee, a flat-rate compensation of £20, regardless of what they had in their bank accounts when they were forced to flee. This cruel blow, coming as it did in the wake of the previous 3 years, was alleviated somewhat by the generosity of his employer, West African Provincial Insurance Company, which had preserved intact both his office and his job, even going as far as to pay all the accrued wages and benefits for the duration of the war. Eno and Ogbonnaya began the painstaking task of rebuilding their lives, relying on the kindness of friends until they settled into a permanent residence in Surulere, a residential and commercial district on the mainland of Lagos. There, the family welcomed Chioma and Ola in 1972 and 1977 respectively, and in 1997, Tochi was added to the family. From West African Insurance Provincial, Ogbonnaya moved to Unity Life and Fire Insurance Company with a mission to revamp the company. He became co-owner and chief executive and managed the company from 1970 to 1977. This period was critical to his burgeoning insurance career. It provided the freedom and opportunity to express his passion and vision for insurance in modern Africa and stamp his spirit of innovation in the business of commercial insurance in a developing economy. He began playing active roles in international insurance and reinsurance, representing Nigeria and Africa, and working on various international committees or agencies, including the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, which was the most important UN agency committed to the development of insurance and reinsurance in developing countries in Africa and Asia. His career was unfolding rapidly. He soon came to the attention of the federal government, who appointed him as pioneering managing director and chief executive of the newly incorporated Nigeria Reinsurance Corporation. The then military head of state, General Olusegun Obasanjo, tasked him with setting up a world-class reinsurance company. Theirs was a relationship that was strengthened with each passing year. From all accounts, the decision by the federal military government to set up the Nigeria Reinsurance Corporation, as well as its timing, was one of the best decisions of Nigeria's military administrations in the context of insurance and the national economy. For Ogbonnaya, it was a well-timed career decision, and he was keen to take on the challenge of the new role. Nigeria Re was launched in 1977, and by 1985 it was universally recognized as the most successful federal government agency in financial and economic terms. After 12 years in the post, he realized his dream to establish a model private insurance company, and on 29 April 1989, the Africa Development Insurance Company, ADIC, was incorporated. In its first 10 years, and notwithstanding challenging times, it continued to play a market-leading role. As Ogbonnaya reached 70 years, he began contemplating his retirement from the day-to-day management of the company. With his mind turned to the matter of succession, he was delighted when in 2004, his daughter Chioma, who had relocated from the United Kingdom, accepted the offer of the role of Executive Director Corporate Services. 2 years later, she was appointed to the post of Managing Director when the company was acquired by Diamond Bank. Over the next few years, ADIC expanded and was subsequently acquired by Insured Participation SA, a francophone company, in 2011. Throughout a career that spanned several decades, Ogbonnaya held top positions in both the private and public sectors of the Nigerian economy. Instrumental to the establishment of the insurance industry in Nigeria, his influence on his chosen field was extended to the African continent and globally. He authored several landmark books on insurance and commentaries on Nigeria. He was Nigeria's first professor of insurance and insurance law, and a leading African authority on corporate governance, insurance and risk management. His appointments, too many to mention, included, between 1972 and 1978, chair of the Nigerian Student Loans Board, which was set up by the General Yakubu Gowon administration to disperse funds to Nigerian students hoping to study at undergraduate and postgraduate levels in Nigeria or abroad. He was president of the West African Insurance Companies Association, founding president of the Professional Reinsurers Association, President of the Chartered Insurance Institute of Nigeria, Chairman of the Nigerian Insurers Association from 1981 to 1983, former Chairman of Africa Continental Bank, Chairman of Cooperative and Commerce Bank, President of the Nigerian Insurance Law Association, Chairman of the Interministerial Committee on Review of Insurance Laws in Nigeria, and Chair of the Cargo Defense Fund of the Nigerian Shippers Council. He was a senior advocate of Nigeria and holder of the National Productivity Order of Merit and Officer of the Order of the Niger. He was the first African to receive the John S. Bickley Gold Medal for Excellence, the highest award for an individual in the world of insurance and risk management. Ogbonaya's life was hallmarked by duty and service. He accepted the invitation to serve as President General of Ohaneze Ndigbo, the socio-cultural organization representing the interests of the Igbos, out of his lifelong desire and passion to see his ethnic group fully integrated into the nation and taking its rightful place. As an elder statesman, his was a unifying voice and a stabilizing influence in his local community and nationally. He was conferred with the title of Omezioha of Item in recognition of his contributions to the development of the nation in the areas of business, finance, insurance, and education. His friendships spanned multiple generations, and he had the ability to put people at ease. He was sought out for his wisdom, fatherly advice, intelligent contributions, problem-solving abilities, skill and technical knowledge, for his humor, and the fact that whenever you were with him, you were guaranteed to have a great laugh. He always acknowledged his merciful Heavenly Father, who gave him the grace to serve in such an exemplary manner. Often, speaking of the invisible hand that guided the course of his life, he attributed his success in its entirety to our Lord. Family was particularly important to him. He cherished times with his children, their spouses, and his grandchildren, and every reunion was an opportunity to strengthen family bonds. His life was not without challenges. Among his most painful experiences were the deaths of his wife Eno in 2009, his sisters Dr. Oriakwu Nwosu in 2012, and Mrs. Ijoma Bakut in 2019, his brothers Chief Sunday Sochi Ogan IRUKWU in 2006, and Barrister Emmanuel IRUKWU in 1990, and his daughter-in-law Mrs. Ifeanyiwa IRUKWU in 2007. Professor Joseph Ogbonnaya IRUKWU enjoyed a well-established, multi-pronged career as a lawyer, educator, author, chartered insurer, and philanthropist. He was renowned for his wisdom and for mentoring thousands who saw him as a father figure.
You can even hear the sound of the cockcrow at dawn.
We have a family slogan, faith in God and service to humanity. The most important creation of God is a human being. And that's why the Bible tells us that He created us in His own image. How I relate to other human beings is an indication of how I believe I relate to God. The good thing about being a Christian family is that you learn to accept every situation as the will of God. It makes life a lot easier. You make your plan, but God makes His own plans. God has been good to me. That's why any opportunity I find to bless others, I take it. There is no human being created by God who God didn't give a talent. It's just that some people are so foolish that they sleep all the time and they don't have time to discover themselves. I've thought about what I'd like to be remembered for. I just like to be remembered for being myself, for having faith in God, in family, in friends, and for having lived with a determined philosophy that propelled me to try and do everything possible to improve my environment, my society, and my country.
After all is said and done, and in the reality of the fading music of life, he came to realize that what is truly of worth is one's relationship with their Creator and the family that He gave you. And so, with this awareness, he sought to make his peace with his Lord and Master, who insured his life for eternity.
He is survived by children Ago, Ikechi, Chizo, Chioma, Ola, and Tochi. Daughters and sons-in-law Shola, Uju, Bajo, and Onome. Grandchildren Jemie, Nonye, Tobechukwu, Risachi, Edward, Rina, Kamsi, Nathan, Matthew, Amarachi, and Sochi. Siblings, Mrs. Edith Diribe, Mr. Okoji IRUKWU, Mr. Jacob Nkuma IRUKWU, Mr. Onyekwere IRUKWU, and Mrs. Obioma Okorafo. Nieces, nephews, cousins, and wonderful friendships that enriched his life tremendously.
Determined he will get there, where there's love for all to share. Someday the clouds will disappear, there will be sunshine. Here the traffic never jams, don't cost much to buy some yams, and the neighbors say hello. And we'll strive to pull you up from down below. You can even hear the sound of the cockcrow at dawn. You can even hear the sound of the cockcrow at dawn. You can even hear the sound of the cockcrow